Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and for your patience. I think there was a little bit of a delay downstairs at security, so we appreciate your patience. My name is Anita Pollitt. I'm a partner here in the Intellectual Property Practice Group at Morgan Lewis, and we are delighted to have all of you here today. On behalf of all of the lawyers from Morgan Lewis inside this room and in the building, as well as our ML Women Initiative, we welcome you here, and we're thrilled to be hosting this program, Passion and Purpose, The Secrets of Gritty Women. This program is a perfect fit for the ML Women Initiative that we launched in 2014. That program was launched in order to harness the strength of our female talent and ensure long-term success for the women that we work with, both inside and outside the firm. And these three women are perfect to help us towards that goal. So we're so glad to have all of you here. And I'm going to introduce the speakers one at a time. At the end, we're actually not going to take questions. We wanted to leave time for the networking event, get to the beverages and food, but they will all be available to answer your questions and to talk about any issues that you want. Our first speaker is Milana Hogan. Milana is the Chief Legal, Recruiting, and Professional Development Officer at Sullivan & Cromwell. Prior to joining Sullivan & Cromwell, she worked at Dixon Shapiro, and before that, the New York office of Milberg LLP. Milana received her BA in Political Science from Brown University and holds a Doctor of Education from the University of Pennsylvania. Milana is, in addition to her first full-time job, the Vice Chair and Chair-elect of the Professional Development Consortium and the Co-Chair of the ABA Commission on Women in the Professions Grit Project. She is the author of Grit, The Secret to Advancement, Stories of Successful Women Lawyer, which will be available for sale after the event. It was published in August 2017 by the ABA. She lives in New Canaan, Connecticut with her husband Phil and their 4 children, Holly, Casey, Charlie, and Kyle. I think that might be her third full-time job. Milana spoke at a terrific program on grit and growth mindset last fall in our New York office with our own Jamie McKeon, and we're happy to have her joining us today, not just because we don't want to be outdone by our New York office, but that's an extra bonus. So please welcome Milana.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, to Morgan Lewis for hosting this event. We're excited to be here, and I'm also very excited to be here along with these 2 lovely ladies who you'll hear from in a moment. What I wanted to do today, I'm just going to take about 20 minutes. I'm going to introduce grit and talk a little bit about what we know about grit. And then I'm going to talk about some of the findings that relate to grit and women lawyers in particular in a number of different contexts. And those findings are summarized in the book that was just published by the ABA in August. And really, that's sort of a labor of love. It's a research project that I've been working with alongside the ABA for many years. So very excited that that is now complete and that we're going to be able to share some of those findings with women lawyers generally. So I'm going to start sort of broadly and sort of work my way into grit. And I'm going to start broadly with a question of whether or not you have to be talented or have some natural talent in order to be successful. And I'm asking that question very broadly and with respect to many different domains. So do you have to be naturally talented to become a chess champion? Do you have to be naturally talented to become an Olympic athlete? Do you have to be naturally talented to become a world-class performer with respect to an instrument of some kind, or a vocalist or something similar? And for years, people have been trying to understand the answer to that question. And I think intuitively, a lot of people would probably say yes. And that's often the story that we tell when we're talking about success. I think often we like to position success, and especially success at very high levels, as something that happens to people who are in some way special, right? Who are sort of born with certain abilities that set them apart from other people. And I think we often think of it that way. And we like to tell stories about that. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the film Amadeus, but it's about Mozart when he was little and sort of growing up. It's actually about his whole life, but starts at that point. And he's this little boy, and he's sort of doing these unbelievably amazing things with music, and you sort of get from that film and from other stories that we like to tell that he was special. He was sort of miraculous in this way, right? And I don't think anybody would sit here and tell you that he wasn't naturally talented, right? Of course he was, right? And a lot of people who are successful are naturally talented. But when we start to really look at what sets truly successful people apart from just their sort of average peers, what we find is that often the explanation for that is not simply talent. And I think if you reflect back on people that you know and have encountered over the course of your career or in school or elsewhere, I think anecdotally we start to see that that unravels a bit, right? I think we all probably went to school with people who were very promising, and we thought this person is likely to become something amazing, right? Most likely to become president, right? We used to do games like that. Most likely to become this, that, or the other thing. And for some people, they did amount to something great, but others didn't. Right? And so how do we explain that if the secret to success is natural talent? Because not everybody who has talent is able to convert that into success. So when people start to look at that and we start to try to understand that a little bit more deeply, there's a number of explanations as to what really contributes to success. So what you see up on the screen there, I don't know if anybody recognizes, probably the last picture is the easiest to recognize, but these are all pictures of Serena Williams at different phases of her career, different stages. The first one is her playing tennis when she's quite young. The second one is her with her father and her sister Venus, right? And they're having a nice moment there on the court, but they're both still quite young. And the last one was taken in January of this year when she won her 23rd major in Australia. And P.S., she was pregnant. Right? So really amazing. And I think I use her as an example because she's obviously someone that's achieved a tremendous amount of success, right? And it would be easy to say, well, she's just naturally talented and that's what it's about. But I think what she would tell you and what others would tell you is that that's in some ways unfair to her, right? She is naturally talented. Of course she is. But there are other things that contributed to that success, right? And some of it was hard work. Really, really hard work. Some of it was about sacrifice. Some of it was about making time for tennis when there were other interesting things to do, like a party or something with friends or another activity that wasn't related to tennis that likely would have been fun to participate in. And instead of making those choices, she made the choice to really focus in on tennis and to hone those skills in a really disciplined way that wasn't easy to do every step of the way. So again, when we look at the literature about what really makes somebody successful, we find that it falls into a number of different areas. I'm going to talk about three. And again, these are thousands of pages of research that I'm going to summarize in about 90 seconds. But the first thing we find, and Serena is sort of a good example of this, is that a lot of times success and what gets somebody to that high level of success has a lot to do with family, culture, and friendship, right? And that can be sort of culture, big C, like culture of what is happening in the world at the moment. And it's also culture, small c, which is, who you're surrounding yourself with, who you choose to be friends with, what family you're born into and what matters to those people. That's often a big part of it as well. And what matters to your friends. What are people striving for? Often if you are friends with people who are very focused on doing well in school, that becomes important to you as well, right? And if you have a family who says, we are really focused on you doing well in school, that tends to influence you in a not insignificant way. So a lot of times it's about family, culture, and friendship. And then again, Serena's a good example of this. She had a father who was very, very committed to her career in tennis and who did a lot of things to help set her up for that. And her family made sacrifices, right? It's not just her and Venus. There are other children in the family, and they all sacrificed to make this possible. Success is also about environment and circumstance. And to some extent, you can summarize that by saying it's sort of good luck to some extent, right? Bill Gates would tell you that one of the reasons he's as successful as he is because he was born, he went to a high school that had a computer at a time when almost no other high school did. And this is sort of way back when computers sort of took up rooms, right? These sort of big machines, right? And he would just go in there and, play around with this machine. And so by the time he sort of graduated and was moving on to the next thing, he had developed this skill that very few people had. And that that helped him, it helped position him for success, right? And that was a little bit about good luck. And I think if we think of our own movement forward in our own careers, sometimes that's what it is, right? Sometimes it's you were in a good spot and somebody chose to leave and there you were, right? So sometimes it's also about good luck. It's also about what they are calling deliberate practice fueled by intrinsic motivation. And that's really where grit comes into play. And I'll talk a little bit about that. If anybody's read Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, you'll be familiar with the 10,000 hour rule. He sort of gets at least externally some credit for it, but it doesn't really come from him. He's the one who talked a lot about it, but it comes from the work of Anders Ericsson, who is a psychologist. I think he's now at the University of Florida. And he really spent his career and continues to do this, studying success and what differentiates expert performers, so sort of the top level of successful people, from people who are good, but nevertheless somewhat average in terms of what they're able to accomplish. And one of the things he's found, and this is closely tied to what I've been talking about, is that the people who are really super expert in things often are people who are differentiated not by their natural talent as assessed by whoever was assessing them at that moment, but instead by the amount of time that they devoted to very specific activities and a very specific kind of practice that he calls deliberate practice, right? And it's not just practice, because we all sort of have heard that practice makes perfect, right? But it's a very specific form of practice that is often quite isolating when you're engaged in it. You're sometimes so supremely focused on the task at hand that the rest of the world sort of falls away and you don't really know what's happening outside of that moment. Sometimes athletes describe it as in the zone, and you sort of feel no pain. And if you can kind of tap into that area where you're really making improvements, that's when you start to really build that success muscle and actually to improve your talent, right? We used to think of talent as something that was somewhat fixed. It's not really, right? We can actually make ourselves more talented at certain things. And Anders Ericsson would tell you that it's through that kind of deliberate practice that helps to get you there and to position you for that. So what the research that I've been doing with the ABA is going to suggest, and I'm going to be much more granular about it in a second, is that grit and growth mindset, which I'll talk about briefly, really the focus of tonight is grit, but the research suggests that both are impactful, are two drivers of success, in part because behaving in a gritty way and engaging in that type of gritty behavior allows you to practice in a very deliberate way and sort of to tap into some of that, and that can be tremendous fuel for developing your skills and your talent and upskilling yourself, literally making yourself better at something. And that's a tremendous driver of success in the long run. So I told you I'd mention mindset briefly. I can't really talk about the research in the book without mentioning it. But mindset is a concept that comes from the work of Carol Dweck, who is again, a psychologist who spent her career studying success, and most often really in the domain of children. So looking at people, how students perform in K through 12, right? She's really sort of focused on that group of people, although she's done some work with professionals as well at this point. But she basically says that there is a mindset spectrum that exists, and everybody sort of falls somewhere on that spectrum. And on that, you can see the spectrum displayed up here on this slide. On the red circle is what is called the strong fixed mindset. And people who fall sort of in that bucket tend to believe that talent is fixed and that ability is fixed and that you have a certain ceiling and you can kind of perform up to that ceiling, but you can't exceed it, right? So if you take math as an example, if I asked you all, are you good at math? You probably could pretty quickly answer that question. Yes or no. Yes, I'm good at math. No, I'm not. And so if you'd use that as a measure, I would tell you I was good at math until I got to calculus, and then I suddenly wasn't anymore. And I had always just just, it had been so intuitive to me in a way that I didn't have to think about it and I didn't have to work hard. And I actually remember very specific moments where my mom said to me, you're not going to get away with this when you get to middle school. You're going to actually have to work hard. And I got away with it. And she said the same thing about high school. You're not going to get away with this. And I got away with it, right? And it wasn't really until I was doing my doctoral work and really trying to dig in and do some hard statistics that I really felt that ceiling and suddenly thought, I've hit my ceiling. And so we all do that a lot of times when we're pursuing an activity. A lot of times we just sort of feel some struggle start to happen in a way, and where sort of that natural thing stops. You make judgments about yourself, and a lot of times you'll say, oh, well, I've hit my ceiling. I literally chose to go to Brown University because they had no core requirements. I kid you not. I was like, I will not do anything that I'm not good at. I will not do math ever again. I'm only going to do the things I enjoy doing, right? So that was a life decision. It worked out fine, right? But that was a life decision that I made, having to do to a certain extent with my perceived ability and a perceived ceiling that I had for myself, right? On the other end of the spectrum, the blue circle is what Carol Dweck calls the strong growth mindset. And people who sort of operate in that zone believe that there is no ceiling on talent, on ability, on any of that for themselves or for other people, right? They believe that you can actually become smarter if you work really hard at certain things. That's another thing we used to think of as fixed, is IQ. You could take a test and it would spit out a number, and that's how smart you are. And that stays the same throughout the course of your life. We now know that that's not really true, right? You can actually change how smart you are in certain domains through certain very targeted and specific exercises. So people operate, across this spectrum. There's a little red line in the middle there, which is just sort of barely growth mindset oriented. And that is the average for where women lawyers live, right? So they're sort of right in the middle, right? Which is an important thing and will come into play later. And I'll explain how that works. Moving on to grit. Grit is defined as passion and perseverance for long-term goals. And I want to unpack that a second because it's an important definition. It's very, very important. I think there's a connotation with grit that may be good or not good, right? I think it may have sort of a negative connotation. I think now there's a lot of talk about it, so people are sort of opening up to the idea that this is a good thing. But it's important to understand what it is and also what it isn't, right? So grit is defined as behavioral persistence in the face of adversity, right? So there has to be something difficult about doing the thing that you're seeking to do. And let's say, for argument's sake, that you want to become the best lawyer you can possibly be. That's not going to be an easy task, right? When I was pregnant, and I've been pregnant for 5 years, but when I was pregnant, I would eat a bagel every single day. And that is one thing that I allowed myself. And it was behaviorally persistent, but it wasn't gritty, right? There was sort of no one standing in the way of the bagel, right? There may have been a guy that wanted the last poppy seed, and then maybe it was a little bit gritty, but for the most part, it's not just repeated behavior. Similarly, you could be a runner. You could run every day. You could run the same circle every day. And unless you're sort of trying to improve your time by doing specific speed work or, running faster and slower and playing with that, you could run every day and never really get faster, right? So it's not just repetition, right? It's behavioral persistence, but in the face of adversity, something has to present in that way to make it not just, okay, I'm going to show up and do the same thing every day. It's also about sustained pursuit of goals and passionate pursuit. And the passion piece is really, people have said it's a linchpin to grit. And I think that's a really important element of it. Also important is that it's sustained over time. And that's really where grit differs from self-control or self-discipline. Often self-control and self-discipline are about not doing things. So for example, I might say, if there are cookies out there, I won't eat the cookies. I'm going to restrain myself. I'm not going to eat the cookies. That would be more about self-discipline, and it's also limited to a moment in time. And grit is really about doing things. It's about showing up and engaging in activities, but it's also focused on longer-term goals. So just, trying to diet to fit into a dress for a high school reunion, that's not gritty, right? That's sort of a moment in time. This is something that you do over the course of your career, and I think for that reason is very interesting when we're thinking about longer-term career goals, right? If you want to be the best lawyer you can possibly be, that's not something you're going to do overnight. It's something you're going to commit to. It's something that you're going to continue to commit to. It's something that you're going to have to sustain that goal over a long period of time to achieve excellence there, right? You're going to really have to dig in. So that is grit. It works in a number of different ways. Most of the work on grit is done by Angela Duckworth. She is at the University of Pennsylvania. I had the pleasure of having her as a teacher. She's amazing. She's done a TED Talk. She's written a book. She's done a lot of really cool things in the grit space. But I give you just some examples. I won't go through them all specifically in the interest of time, but these are domains in which grit has been a tremendous predictor of success, often over and above things that we tend to focus on when we're trying to either hire or recruit people that we think are going to be successful. So, for example, the law firm world tends to be very focused on where you went to law school, whether it was prestigious, how well you did, what your GPA was, where you fall in terms of class rank, and the like. And grit has often been shown to be a better predictor of who succeeds in the long term than those traditional measures, right? And so you can see that at play in a study they did with teachers involved with Teach for America. You can see it in a sales force. Grit was actually a tremendous predictor of literally how much money people were able to bring in. At West Point, it was the best predictor of who lasted through what's called, I think, Beast Barracks, which is basically their boot camp when they first arrive, right? So there's sort of this physical component to it. It was the very best predictor of who did well, who got furthest in the National Spelling Bee. So it's sort of all domains, right? You can see that it's a really impactful predictor of success. So I knew all of that when I started to work with the ABA. And I had done my dissertation at Penn on grit and the impact of grit, how that impacted success for women practicing in big law, right? So I was looking very specifically at what does that mean for that group of people. And we knew that it had some really important connections. I also knew my audience. I knew lawyers like evidence. And so I wasn't going to sort of do a study that was just, well, these people think it matters, right? It wasn't going to be the type of study where I did some interviews and didn't back that up with some hard science, right? So I wanted to do it in a very specific and deliberate way. I wanted to be able to say if somebody has a grit score of 5 versus a grit score of 4 would be sort of less, literally less on the grit scale. What does that mean in terms of measures that matter to firms? So, for example, what does that mean in terms of how somebody performs on an annual performance evaluation? Is somebody who's more gritty likelier to do better on a measure like that? And the answer is yes, right? Yeah, so that's a good question. So there's a grit scale, and this is actually one of the brilliant things about the research that I had nothing to do with. Angela Duckworth has developed a scale, and so it's like a short quiz or test that you take, and you answer questions about yourself and your behavior, and it spits out a score for you. So I was able to use that. She went through the tremendous effort of testing and validating it and making sure it sort of was sound in all the ways scientifically you'd want it to be. So that's literally what I used. I was able to give people that, and it spit out a score. So that's how I'm measuring it. Yeah, there's other ways to measure it as well, but that was what I used. So the study was a mixed methods approach. As I said, I did talk to people because I think the stories are important and very, very interesting, right? And that's sort of, in some ways, far more interesting than the hard science, right? Is sort of hearing how people operate in a gritty way in stressful situations really was telling and inspiring a lot of times as well. So I had sort of the stories to complement this hard science, right? So it was a mixed methods approach. I sent a survey to women lawyers through the ABA, and we ultimately got roughly 5,000 responses, so we had a nice data set to work with, and we sent it to everybody because I knew something about women lawyers practicing in big law, right? But that's a very small subset, as it turns out, of the lawyers that exist in the world, right? It's a small subset, and we wanted to know specifically how this impacts lawyers in other domains. So we sent it to everybody, and people self-identified. They were solo practitioners, lawyers practicing in-house, lawyers in government. We even had some judges, not technically practicing law, but certainly involved in this process, and then lawyers in firms of all sizes, right? So literally one person all the way up. Of course, you had to have different measures of success for the different domains, right? So a solo practitioner isn't going to have an annual performance evaluation, so you have to ask different questions that get to what success is and what it looks like. And this is what we found. We found that there is a statistically significant, and again, this is hard science, right, that we felt good that we could back up, right? We feel good about talking about this, between grit, mindset, and various measures of success for lawyers in all practices, right? So it matters across the board, no matter where you're practicing and how you're practicing. Grit is impactful, at least in some way, in any domain that we looked at. We also found that as a baseline, lawyers are pretty gritty. I showed you earlier the scale, the mindset scale, where they sort of fall kind of in the middle. That's not true for grit. The average grit score for lawyers across the board is right around 4, which is pretty interesting. I'll show you there's some slight variations there. You can see here. Thank you. You can see here the average grit score for lawyers in different domains, right? So it's right around 4 for everybody. Again, that's average, and there's variations within that. And we found that a lot of lawyers display growth mindset characteristics when they're dealing with really challenging situations. I talked earlier about growth mindset, but basically the idea here is when they were faced with something that was a hurdle in some way that might have been perceived as a setback, they were able to view that instead as an opportunity for learning, and not to internalize that as some reflection on their own ability, but instead to say, I don't really believe or accept, maybe even to be more accurate, I don't accept a ceiling for myself. Instead, I believe that this is an opportunity for me to get better in some way, even if this isn't what anybody would call a great performance or a great success in its moment. So it matters across the board. I won't talk about all of these. I will give you one key finding. Again, you can, I'm happy to email these slides around, and they're discussed in great detail in the book, but I'll give you one from each area just to wrap up and try to keep us on time here. So I mentioned one from law firms, which is that grit is very highly correlated to how you perform on a performance evaluation. So literally, everybody does these differently, but most firms at this point are giving at least annual performance evaluations, and what they're saying is, you know, let's say you get a 5 for sort of top performance, a 4, a 3, and so on. It was tightly correlated to your score. So if you were grittier, you tended to perform better. And there's lots of reasons why that might be. But the grittier folks tended to be really motivated to really dig in, to always keep their eye on the long-term goal, not to sort of interpret success as fixed to a specific outcome in a specific moment related to a specific task, but instead to sort of have that long horizon view. For in-house lawyers, lots of findings as well. The one that I found most interesting was that in talking to in-house lawyers about how they measured their own success, one of the things that they said over and over was they measured their success by the extent to which they were treated as a strategic partner versus somebody who was more of a cheerful executor, right? Somebody that they would say, hey, we've decided to do this thing, and now we need you to come in and do the lawyer stuff related to this, right? So was it that, or was it instead, we are thinking about doing this thing, and we want you to be at the table as we're making the decision and deciding whether or not we're going to go forward with this, right? So grit influenced the moment, literally the moment along that timeline at which they were brought into the discussion, right? So gritty people tended to be viewed more as strategic partners, and I think that's a really interesting and impactful finding for in-house. Looking at solo practitioners, government, and nonprofit, there's a lot of different iterations of how grit matters in this way. Performance is measured very differently and frankly inconsistently across this group, so it was hard to really hone in on it. But what was clear is it was a reliable indicator of how well somebody did perform, whether they were on a track, if there was a track, whether there was advancement, and if so, in what period of time, and also tenure within an organization, right, which is important. How long they stayed was related to grittiness and also to some extent to mindset as well. So that's a very brief overview of what's out there. Again, it's summarized more fully in the book. And now I'm going to turn it over to Caroline, who's going to talk more specifically about grit and the different kinds of grit that exist.
We're going to now hear from Caroline Miller. For 3 decades, Caroline Miller has been a pioneer with her groundbreaking work in areas of goal setting, accomplishment, grit, happiness, and success. She is recognized as one of the world's leading positive psychology experts on this research and how it can be applied to one's life. for maximum transformation and growth. Caroline is the author of 7 best-selling books, including Positively Caroline, My Name is Caroline, Creating Your Best Life, and Getting Grit. She's been featured in hundreds of magazines, newspapers, and other media around the world, including BBC, World News, the New York Times, and CNN. A magna cum laude graduate of Harvard University, Caroline is one of the first 34 graduates from the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program at the University of Pennsylvania, and she teaches in the Wharton Business School Executive Education program. Please join me in welcoming Caroline Miller.
Thank you. You can tell I'm not a lawyer because I'm in an orange dress. We don't have to do black when we're writers and consultants. Thank you for coming. Thank you. I know time is money, time is love, but I know this is a hot topic, and it's particularly hot for women. And I have a real passion for illuminating why it matters so much for women. So I'm going to talk as quickly as I can to make sure I get some of the gist of what matters most to me. But first I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story, if this will advance. That doesn't work. Well, no, they said to turn it on. So when you turn it on, it actually works. Okay. And so let me tell you a story. There are 2 great outcomes, I think, positive outcomes that show you how grit can really become a life-changing ingredient. And my story starts with my 5th book is Creating Your Best Life, which was the outgrowth of my capstone at the University of Pennsylvania back in 2005-2006, a really life-changing, magical year, because when you're exposed to the science of well-being and success, which was what we learned in this master's program in applied positive psychology, you can't not be the same. You're not the same person anymore. You can't not think about your life in a very different way. So I emerged from that program extremely different, and I think the trajectory of my life really changed. But my capstone project was Creating Your Best Life. It came out early 2009. It is the first book to connect the science of happiness with the science of success. But in that book, I was the first person to introduce Angela Duckworth's work to the mass market because she was just starting to come up with these great findings about West Point and Teach for America, and it's been expanded. It's who gets picked for special forces, which men stay married, for example. So the findings have really expanded. But I was so intrigued by her work, which was really in its nascent stages, that I put Chapter 10 in Creating Your Best Life is about grit. So fast forward to a wedding a couple years later, and Angela and I are both on the dance floor. Neither one of us can dance very well, so we're dancing near each other. And I go, hey, dance. I dance up to her. I go, Angela, you got to write a book about grit because everyone's interested in it. I'm passionate about it. It's really, I think, the secret to success as far as I can tell, because I really study the impact of hard goals, because the happiest people wake up every day to hard goals. And if you're going to have hard goals, you have to have this secret sauce called grit. So Angela looks at me, shimmies away, and says, I'm never going to write a book. You go write a book. I'm not a writer. And so famous last words, right? So a couple of years ago, I called her. I said, hey, Angela, my agent's been shopping a book about grit for about a year, and we're not getting any nibbles. So I just wanted to clarify some of the research. And she said, I have some really bad news for you. She said, I was talked into writing a book, and it's coming out next May, which, was last May. And then she said something to the effect of it was the largest advance in the history of psychology books. So what my agent found out is the reason no one was interested in my book was because everyone thought there was only going to be one book that anybody would ever buy about grit. So what did I do? I decided to bet on myself. And I guess if you're writing a book about grit, you better have some grit. So it was my 7th book. It is my 7th book. And I thought, my God, I know how to write books. I've got a good reputation. I'm going to write it anyway. So I started to check into hotels all over D.C. So I would do hot wire bids on Wednesday, and then I would come up with these great hotel bids. And I moved into one called the Even Hotel. How many of you have stayed at the Even Hotels? It's very interesting. It's an old Holiday Inn, and they're retrofitting them to be a hotel where every single guest room is a fitness room. So you walk in and there's like TRX systems and yoga balls. So every room's a fitness center. So I do a little Instagram post. Hey, I'm writing a book about grit, and I happen to be in a hotel where every room's a fitness center. So park that one place, and then let me come back to this. So I'm doing all these weekends writing this book about grit that nobody wants, and suddenly I find out there's a publisher who's heard that I have a book that's ready to go. So they call me up and they say, hey, we hear you have a book that's ready to go. I said, yeah, absolutely. And they said, but do you think Angela Duckworth would blurb your book and say it's worth buying? I was like, I don't know. So I call Angela, and she says, of course I will blurb your book. You have a lot to say. So the day before her book came out and hit #1 in 30 countries, she was on the phone telling another publisher to buy my book. So I love to tell this story because it's so generous. And Getting Grit was named one of the 10 books that will change your life in 2017. So there's something to be said for believing in yourself and having grit. But back to the Even Hotels. A month and a half ago, I got an email from, this is what happens when you do hard things and bet on yourself and have some grit. Get an email from this ad agency. Hey, we represent the Even Hotels, and we're doing a whole new campaign. And we are featuring the customers as our heroes, and we want to do an ad campaign about you writing your book in the Even Hotel. So I just flew to Brooklyn and recreated writing my book, Getting Grit, in the Even Hotel. So watch for the Even Hotel ads. So it's coming. So you can tell I care about this topic. I was willing to put my career really on ice for a few weeks while I moved to Florida and spent time with a friend, and then did all these working all week and checking into hotels all weekend. There's my husband standing right there who lived through it. He knows this hotel gig. It's like Virginia Woolf, a room of one. So bye, Haywood. I'm heading to the Even Hotel. See you next time. Anyway. And so I'm passionate about it because it really matters to me. This is my ikigai. This is what I wake up to do. Is Getting Grit is my 7th book. Creating Your Best Life is about goals. And now my passion, I believe I wake up to share the evidence-based tools of how do you set and pursue the right goals, and how do you cultivate this quality of grit, which really has been seen to be this real differentiator between being good and being extraordinary. And I have a stake in the ground on this, and very quickly I'll just tell you that 30 years ago I nearly died from an eating disorder. I had bulimia. I grew up here, high standards in my family, Olympic gold medalist, just a lot of pressure on us to be successful. And part of that was, how could I have the best body and go to swim practice and swim fast? So I fell into this pit of bulimia back in the 1970s, when if you had it, you signed your death certificate. You were going to die from it. Nobody survived it. And yet I did. I hit my last bottom in 1984. I was a billboard walking around, talented and successful, but not gritty, because I couldn't beat this thing. I protected my ego at all costs. Like Milana says, I was just, went to Harvard, and it's like, don't take any classes where you won't get good grades. And so it was really my eating disorder that taught me how to be gritty. And that's my stake in the ground about this topic on grit, is because what I did have was I had talent, I had success. I had the bumper sticker virtues. I had all those things that, just kind of define that you're checking the list of, a high achiever. What I didn't have was grit. So when I hit my last bottom in 1984, that was when I learned that I had to develop the ability to keep going, to be resilient, to have a setback and still get up and keep trying. And fortunately for me, I hit my bottom in Baltimore, and there happened to be a very strong 12-step community there. And that saved my life, and it gave me hope. And there's a lot of truth to how you overcome an addiction and how it relates to grit. But basically what I'll say is that a woman stood up at a meeting in February of 1984, and she said a sentence that really altered the course of my life, and is why I'm here today. She just stood up and said, my name is Betsy, and I'm recovering from bulimia one day at a time. And I just remember every atom in my body started to vibrate, because during these 7 long years of having this eating disorder and really hiding it from everybody, nobody knew about my eating disorder. I'd never heard anybody say they'd gotten better. I had no hope. In fact, nobody had hope. And she gave me hope. And because of that, everything in my life changed. And so when it comes to setting hard goals and having grit, you have to have this ingredient of hope. I had hope, and because of that, I persisted. But this is what I live to do now, is to really share this, in particular women. My next book is going to be about women in grit because of the findings that I had when I did my own research. So let me tell you where I differ from my wonderful friend Angela, who really has been an angel in my life. Angela's definition is what you've already heard: passion and persistence in pursuit of long-term goals. But as I thought about it, I have had to cultivate this quality of grit in order to overcome my eating disorder. And by the way, stay in recovery for 30 unbroken years. It's a real miracle that I've been able to be one of the few people, as far as anyone knows, who really got better and stayed better. I realized that grit is not always good. Her definition does not cover the gamut of when you work with people the way I do as an executive coach. You have to have the kind of grit that is good grit. And this is my definition for it. I think that grit is only good when it awes and inspires other people who observe you in the ways in which you pursue your goals. So this is my definition. And I think Malala Yousafzai is the perfect paragon of what I call authentic grit, because it's still about passion. It's still about doing hard things. But where I differ is where I fall into systems theory. It has to make the world a better place. It has to uplift the group that you're around, the people, the community. It has to uplift the system. And so this is where I've really put my mark in the grit field. I think there's good grit and I think there's bad grit. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each one of them. And so let me tell you about bad grit. Let's talk about stupid grit. Because I think sometimes we as women end up doing things not because we should do them, but because we can do them, or we're doing them for other people, or we're finishers at all costs. Because face it, to just be a woman who's good at something, you have to be that much better than any other man on the planet. I have one daughter. Her name is Samantha. I named her after Bewitched, if anybody's really curious. That's as shallow I can really be. And so she's a 2L at Harvard Law School, and she and I were talking as all these hashtag Me Too stories were coming out about the fact that she and I have both had, sexual unwanted advances in our lives. And the fact that she has already faced discrimination as a 25-year-old woman. When I talk to my husband and my two sons, they've never faced anything like that. And so I think we as women, we already know that we have to work hard and be exceptional. But when do we take it too far? I think my eating disorder was stupid grit. I have gone too far, and I think this is what we see when people have a goal that they're fixed on, and they see the mountaintop. It's summit fever in mountaineering. You see the summit, but you're blinded to the fact that there's a whiteout coming, and the Sherpas are telling you to turn around, and the other climbers you're roped into are telling you to turn around. Stupid grit is what we also see in offices where people just hit the wall. I wonder how many female lawyers may be scoring high on grit, but it's really stupid grit. What is the toll it's taking on you and your body and your dreams? I think it's really worth thinking about, because if it's not awing and inspiring other people, if it's not making you become your best self, then I have to wonder, is it really good grit? And I'm going to let you think about that as I go into some other kinds of bad grit. There's also faux grit. And so as I looked at our society, what I realized is we have this whole shortcut generation. So many kids are red-shirted now. We never used to have red-shirted kids for kindergarten. And I watched as my kids were growing up, all these bizarre shortcuts. I mean, they're even taking parallel parking out of the driver's test because it's too hard. So everything is just a little too easy. But we find that people are taking shortcuts, and it's kind of embodied in this, performance-enhancing drugs and shortcuts and people faking their research to get PhDs. But this isn't good grit either. When you want people to think you've done hard things, but you fake the results or you've taken shortcuts, that's also not a good kind of grit. Good grit does not repel people. One of the things you see with bad grit, the wrong kind of grit, is it repels people. And here's the last kind of bad grit, selfie grit. So in a culture where everybody's always posting their relationship status and their CrossFit workouts on Facebook every night, I have to wonder, is it really good if you're doing hard things but you have to tell people all the time? I don't think so. And so Rob O'Neill, the Navy SEAL who decided to go public and break the code of the special forces, the quiet professionals, he decided to say, I'm the one who shot Osama bin Laden. It was me. This is something that I think has also become way too common in our culture, where we have to always talk about ourselves. And so one of the things I would really implore you to think about is in an office, in an environment, are people who have grit who talk about themselves all the time uplifting the state of play? I don't think so. So I want to talk to you quickly about the three things that I have seen when there's more than three, and there's all in my book, Getting Grit. But there are three things that I want all of you as women in particular to think about, because here's my stake in the ground about why I'm standing here and why I care so much about this, is because we are facing now an epidemic in women and health that we've never seen before. And that is we have women at midlife dying now earlier than previous generations from what we call diseases of despair. So middle-aged women are now living shorter, more unhappy lives than previous generations. And why is it? It's because many of us have lost our passion and our purpose. We don't wake up with an ikigai. We don't feel pulled forward by what we're doing. Maybe we've lost sight of what brings us joy. And so if we're going to talk about grit, I have to give you a cautionary story, tale, which is make sure you're pursuing things that also are purposeful, that make your life better, make the world better. Because if you're just out there going after something with passion and pursuing hard things just to be a finisher, to be persevering, it may be at quite a cost. Because this has never been seen before. And the rest of my life is really devoted now to helping women have the right kind of grit and to turn around and to pull along other women who need to learn some of the qualities that maybe they feel hopeless. And so if you have it, one of the things I'd like you to do is turn around and pull someone along with you. And so here are the three things that I want to emphasize tonight very quickly. I find that gritty people have trained themselves when they have a challenge in front of them. They don't ask themselves, why me? They ask themselves, why not me? Why not? Why not go for it? Too often we see people comparing themselves out of hard things. This is Katie Ledecky, a local swimmer. Many of you probably know. She's considered like the most extraordinary male or female athlete on the planet. But one thing that's really interesting about Katie Ledecky is her coach challenged her at the age of 14 to think about the best thing that could happen to her that year, the very best thing. And she came back with a kind of a small answer, which was to make the Olympic team. Now, at 14, that's extraordinary. But he knew her capacity for hard work, and he knew her talent. And so he said, no, Katie, try again. And she sat back and then thought, and she said, I don't know, to win the Olympics? And 15-year-old Katie Ledecky did go out, and she did win the Olympics, and she set the world record at the age of 15 at the 2012 Olympics. But what did it start with? It started with her asking herself, why not, when she was faced with a challenge that her coach put in front of her. So I want you to think about when something comes at you that's really hard, your own goal or someone else's, what do you say? Do you say why not, or do you say why? Gritty people say why not. The other thing they do is they change the channel. When you're in the middle of doing something hard and it becomes emotionally difficult or physically difficult or difficult in some way and you just want to quit, what I found is every single person I interviewed had a place they went to in their heads that they had prearranged. Somewhere in their heads, it was a spiritual phrase, it was a picture, it was a song, it was something that allowed them to persist that much longer than other people. They did not quit. And this woman is partly why our world is safer today. How many of you know who this is? Okay. We also find that people with the right kind of grit are very humble. You don't know their story unless they tell you. This is Sandy Grimes. She's the woman who did not quit at the CIA in trying to figure out who was the mole who was selling out the KGB assets. 17 Russian generals were murdered on her watch because there was a mole, Aldrich James, who's spending the rest of his life in jail. Sandy Grimes was one of the only people who for 9.5 years tried to figure it out, didn't quit. And when I said, what did you think about when you wanted to quit? First of all, she said, are you kidding? I would never quit. Second, she said, I either saw my dead Russian assets in my head or I saw the smug little smile of Rick Ames. She knew it was him. You have to catch a spy in the act of espionage. So they changed the channel. Think ahead of time. What's the channel I can change? And the last thing I want to leave you with is gritty people are on winning teams, and they create winning teams. And this is where I want to say to women, we have to get better at uplifting each other. We have to get better at supporting each other, being on teams. 2 months ago, Harvard and Yale women started a salon series here in Washington for the first time. They joined forces. and they announced their very first topic, and it was completely sold out. There were people saying, we have to have video feeds. How can we have more of these? What was the topic? Women undermining other women. Women not helping other women to succeed. I got one of the Willy Wonka golden tickets, and I want to tell you, I went, and it was one of the most extraordinary 2 hours of my life, because all I heard were stories about woman-on-woman violence, women taking other women down. That's not how we're going to succeed. That's not how we're going to uplift other people. This team that I just want to, in my last minute, share with you is the 1976 Yale Women's Crew Team. So back when Title IX became law in, I think, 1972, you're all lawyers, you can tell me if I've got it wrong, 1972, it really didn't have a lot of teeth. It wasn't making a lot of strides. So what happened? It wasn't one woman who made a difference, because when women come together collectively, what we see is that they change history. And I don't have time to go into all the movements of women who came together to support each other, but this is one that I chose to highlight because the Yale Men's Crew Team had these wood panel blockers and these amazing hot showers, and they were incredibly lackluster. And then you had the women who had trailers with no heat and no showers, after crew in used boats, going and sitting in a bus while their hair froze into icicles, and they all got pneumonia. And they decided one day they were going to, as a group, go into the head of Yale Physical Athletics, or Yale PE, whatever you call it. And they went in and they made the agreement they were going to go in. They all walked in. They stripped off their shirts, and they had Title IX written on their backs and on their chests. And they started to read a letter. And they said, these are the bodies that Yale University is abusing. These are the bodies that are working hard for you that are not getting parity. And right after that, everything changed. And it started a domino effect that helped people like me. I was a swimmer at Harvard University. It didn't happen because of one woman. It happened because of teams coming together. And so the very last thing I want to say to you, because I'm at 20 minutes and 45 seconds, is in Wonder Woman, in the beginning of Wonder Woman, you know, Diana's fighting with her aunt, Robin Wright, and they're fighting and they're doing sword play, and Diana, you know, kind of knocks the sword out, and then she looks away. And the next thing you know, Robin Wright picks up the sword and comes at her, and she goes, don't ever assume the battle is going to be easy. It's always going to be hard for us. You stopped fighting because you thought it was going to be fair. It's not fair. And so what I want to say to you is, it isn't fair. And if we as women are going to succeed in our chosen passions, the things that matter, the things that uplift and awe and inspire other people, it's going to be hard. So you got to get this quality of grit. And if you have it, all I'm going to leave you with, my call to action is turn around and mentor somebody else. Teach them how to have the right mindset. Teach them how to change the channel. Teach them how to have big goals. Because we're losing too many of our sisters at midlife, and this is a crisis. And if we don't all come together and pull as we climb, we're all going to suffer. Thank you.
So after practicing law for nearly 20 years, Anne left her job as a partner here at Morgan Lewis to focus on thriving in the legal profession, and this is where I start weeping a little bit in the background. She is the chair of the ABA Law Practice Division's Attorney Wellbeing Committee and a member of the National Task Force on Lawyer Wellbeing. She previously earned a Master's of Applied Positive Psychology from Penn while she was a full-time partner at Morgan Lewis. That's real grit. And now is in her 4th year as a doctoral student in positive organizational psychology. Anne has been a teaching assistant and mentee of the co-founders of Positive Psychology, and she is also the founder of Aspire, an educational consulting firm focused on lawyer thriving. The ABA recently published Anne's book called Positive Professionals, which reflects her status as an emerging thought leader on positive workplaces in the legal profession. And on a personal level, I can speak for many of my Morgan Lewis colleagues in telling you that having our former partner and our friend back in the building is a delight and an excellent bonus to all the other benefits for this fantastic program. Please join me in welcoming Anne Brafford.
All right, let's get mine up. While I'm getting it up, maybe you want to shake out a little bit. We've been sitting here now for like an hour, and it's late. I'll try to keep you awake. All right, so what I'm going to focus on is how organizations can help develop cultures that foster grit among its people. Let's see if this works for me. And before I get to that, what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about how I got to you before you today talking about grit. So it starts, here's me, 1972. 2-year-old there. I didn't yet know I was going to be a lawyer. The world was my oyster. Look how happy I was. And I actually started saying that I wanted to be a lawyer when I was 11 years old. So this was a lifelong dream, which was kind of weird because I was the first kid in my family to even go to college, came from a working class family in Iowa. And so where this came from, nobody's sure, but I suspect it's the Catholic nuns and all their unfairness that I was sort of rebelling against. But 11 years old, I started saying I wanted to be a lawyer. So I remember the day I got my letter from University of Iowa Law School accepting me and the tears in my eyes and the whole thing. And then, so 1996, when I got my law degree, one of the happiest, proudest days of my life and my parents' life as I walked across, got that degree that I've been talking about for so many years. Then I was so lucky to get a job here at Morgan Lewis, advanced partner, advanced equity partner, started here in DC, moved to California, became the practice group leader, the head of the office, the hiring partner, all of those good things, all of these outward objective factors of success. And I was so excited, again, that I started talking about it when I was 11 years old, to finally sort of feel like you were achieving a lifelong dream. I had a lot of pride in what I had been able to accomplish. 2008, I went to my 20-year high school reunion, and an old friend of mine pulled a note out of his pocket and said, "I've been keeping this for you." I can't believe he had like 20 years, right? He kept this note, and here's what it said: "I will change the world for the better, I hope." I even signed it to make it official. And Brafford. And that's a picture of me at the time that I wrote it. And I'm really proud that that hair could have been a lot worse. The Aquanet didn't work that well on my hair, so that was good. So I got this note, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. I unfolded it, saw what it was, looked at him, looked down at the note again, and I started to cry. And the reason was, it hit me that what that 11-year-old had aspired to do in the world, I didn't feel like I was living up to that. I didn't feel like what I was doing as a lawyer was helping to make the world a better place. I was an employment litigator. I defended corporations who were accused of harassment and discrimination. Never felt bad about what I did. It was really good work. I was good at it. But at the end of the day, as I got older, I started asking more and more, is this, in my one short life, is this enough? Is this enough purpose? Is this enough meaning? And eventually got to the point where I couldn't say yes anymore. And it led to a very difficult decision that I liken to tearing an arm off, of making the decision to leave. And not to leave the profession, but to at least leave the practice of law. So as Anita mentioned, while I was still a practicing partner, I got a master's degree in applied positive psychology, and which is great. Yes, that look on your face, that's how I felt the entire time. It was crazy. But it did sort of put the light bulb on in my head that I want to stay in the legal profession, but maybe this is the new path. And so while I was still in that program, I decided to leave the practice of law and to go back to school and to pursue thriving and try to understand more about why did my lifelong dream not live up to my dreams? Why was it not working? And are things that I can do, that I can learn the science about, that I can come back into the profession and help sort of like people like me? Are there ways that we can tweak our cultures and tweak our profession so that more people feel a sense of fulfillment in their work? So now I'm a PhD student at Claremont Graduate University in positive organizational psychology, and I am finding a great sense of meaning, that my sense of meaningfulness is now helping to create meaningfulness for other people. So that's the good news. The bad news is that I became a statistic. Looks like one of my values is missing up there. But so like many women, I left. And the retaining women lawyers is a problem. That's that number that says value should be 90%. So it's nearly every large law firm. This was a study that was done of like the 200 largest law firms. So nearly every firm said that retaining women lawyers was a problem for their firm that they were trying to address. And 31% that said that attrition is a major obstacle to women advancing to equity partner. And the study also found that the percent of women equity partners had remained stagnant for over a decade. So although we keep talking about wanting greater representation and supporting our women, just the needle isn't really moving. And the only 4% of top leadership jobs in the largest 100 firms are held by women, and men still are much more likely to make partner than women. And this isn't just in law firms, it's sort of across the law. The numbers are pretty much staying the same. It's sort of in this 80% range, that there's about 20% women in big law, equity partners, federal judges, Fortune 500 general counsel, law school deans. We're all sort of hanging out at this same number of not getting beyond that 20% number. So most companies and firms, frankly, view this problem as a woman's issue. And that's sort of how it gets categorized. And the efforts to address the underrepresentation has taken a couple of paths. One is the idea of fixing women, that if women were just more of this or less of this, if they were just more like men, then they would be more likely to succeed and they would stay around. So teach them business development skills and leadership skills and give them special mentoring. And maybe if we make them more like men, that will help. And the other paths have been, the other focuses in addition to fixing women have been implicit bias and intentional discrimination. And having come from, decades of being an employment discrimination lawyer, I can tell you that those are important and real issues. But my point here is that I think that the issue is more complex than this idea of fixing women and implicit bias and discrimination, because we've been talking about these things for a long time now, and the needle's not moving. And so is there another approach? Is there another way of thinking about this that we might add to these ways that we're already thinking? And some companies are finally coming to the realization that maybe focusing on sameness isn't the right way to go. Maybe equality isn't just about assuming everyone is the same and treating them the same. And it might be that more than anything else, that the reason that we still have this big underrepresentation of women at the top is that the organizations just aren't friendly environments to women. And so the focus of my work, a lot of my research now, is on the question of, are there real gender differences that make a difference in the workplace, so that instead of trying to make cultures in which everyone is treated the same, we acknowledge and embrace differences and try to manage that way. So what I'm proposing is that it might be that equality doesn't flow from sameness. And it might be that most organizations today were designed by men to match male motivational patterns. So things like strict hierarchy, competition, external rewards. It was the men that built these organizations, so it's not at all a surprise that they were built in a way that matched their motivational patterns that might not be the same as women's motivational patterns, at least on average. And it might be that fixing women to act and think like men isn't the answer. And it might be that if we stop trying to fix women and instead open our minds to new possibilities of the way we might work and behave and be, that we can harness the full potential of everyone. And address everyone's uniqueness and not trying to make us all the same. So the new approach that I'm asking us to think about is whether we can redesign our organizations in a way that is more welcoming to everybody. What's that? Please close all applications. Let's hope that's not going to happen. Okay. And I'm certainly not the first person that has started talking about this idea that there might be real gender differences that matter. There's some leadership experts that I've been really closely following. Their names are Barbara Annis and Keith Marin, and they propose the idea of gender intelligence within organizations. And what gender intelligence, how it's defined, is acknowledging and embracing and understanding that there are gender differences. And that it makes sense to talk more openly about them and talk about how our organizations support them or don't. And I do want to pause just for a minute about, I'm going to talk about some of the research on the patterns of gender differences, and there's always people that it makes them squeamish that I'm putting people into boxes. So I just want to emphasize that, like anything, this is on a continuum, and the patterns, and on average, there are differences. There are gender differences that may make a difference. And it's only been more recently that these differences have been more openly discussed and researched. For like about 20 years ago, I mean, this is still quite new, 20 years ago is when there was much more open discussion about it, because prior to that, the feminist thinking at that time was that talking about differences will only harm women, which I completely understand. That had been the truth of history, that if you point out a difference, it was probably going to be used against women. And so it was very politically incorrect and unacceptable for social scientists to actually study the anatomy of like gender differences in the brain and chemical differences. And now there's a more open environment where there's much more research going on that confirms kind of what we probably all intuitively know, that, hey, there's differences between men and women on average. So let's not get to that yet. So there's many possibilities in going forward with this idea of gender intelligence, what forms it might take. My research focuses on the experience of meaningful work. And that idea, the experience of meaningful work and creating it, relates directly to grit. And from Milana and Caroline, you heard good definitions of what grit is and what it isn't. The simple definition is perseverance and passion toward long-term goals. And just so we're clear on the way Angela Duckworth actually measures it, passion isn't an emotional quality, it's a consistency. So all grit means is that you do the same thing for a long time and you get back up every time you fall down. And that's the idea of how she measures grit. And what I've been hearing, the idea of grit, partly from Milana's work and others, that word is being thrown around a lot in the legal profession and elsewhere. And it seems like it's very often misunderstood, that it's being used in a way that is, one group or another doesn't have enough grit. And what people are really saying is like it's some kind of a mental toughness that people are missing, like they need to put their football helmets on and just go in there and be stronger. And that can lead to like what Caroline called stupid grit, but that's not really what it is. That's not really how Angela defines it. It doesn't have to do with just sticking to it, sort of no matter what else is going on. And what she found, although she doesn't measure the idea of passion in a way that is an emotional commitment, in her research, she has found consistent qualities or psychological resources that gritty people have. And here's the four of them. That the reason that people are able to sustain this effort over the long term is interest, capacity to practice, meaning and purpose, and hope. And organizations can influence all of these things with its people. So interest is just the idea of, do you enjoy your work? If you don't enjoy your work as a lawyer, it's going to be really hard to get up every day and keep at it, because the job does get hard and is hard. So if you don't enjoy it, or we're not helping others in our organizations have an enjoyable experience, we shouldn't be surprised if they leave. So second is capacity to practice, with both of the other speakers have talked about. So with a lawyer, it might be something like, am I willing to sit down and read 100 cases because that's what's going to take for me to understand this issue. Meaning and purpose. So what Angela found in her research is that these are actually in order that they tend to develop. So in the beginning, novices, it's really about they become interested in something, and they're probably kind of good at. So they get applause and acknowledgement, and that feels good, and so they keep at it and they want to get better. As time goes on, and novices grow into greater experts, they have a growing sense of meaning and purpose, and that is important for their sustained grit. And for them, meaning and purpose is especially connected to the outer world. So do I feel like what I'm doing is helping others, is somehow important in contributing to society? And last is hope, which is the idea of resilience. And this really goes on throughout the process from novice through expert, that am I willing, every time I fall down, am I willing to get back, pick myself back up and keep at it? And again, all of these qualities can be supported by an organization. And the one that I'm really going to focus on, and a lot of my research focuses on, is the idea of meaning and purpose and how we cultivate that in an organization. I'm not going to talk about this. Okay, so let's talk about how can organizations cultivate the sense of meaningful work. But let's first define, what do I mean by meaningful work? And this is a fast-growing area of research, of just this experience of meaningful work. So how many of you are familiar with Daniel Pink's book, Drive? Yeah, it's a great book, and he has a really great line in it that sort of explains why this area is getting so much attention. That what he says is that the American workforce is being more and more drawn toward meaningful work, that we're becoming purpose maximizers rather than profit maximizers. And I think that's absolutely right. And this, the intellectual work that's dominating our economy, and people are spending so much time devoted to their work, they want to have a sense that it's important and meaningful. Like my dad was a tire builder at Firestone. They manufactured tractor tires. And there's probably no way that he was going to get a great sense of meaning and purpose out of that. But manufacturing jobs are going away. And so what sustained him was his family, right? But now, so as a lawyer, given how much we're devoted to our jobs, and I know professional development people are here as well, same thing, that we want a sense of meaning. And so there's a number of definitions. There's not a full consensus on what the definition of meaningful work is. But what I have here are some questions that are the themes throughout the definitions and the research. So do you feel a good fit between your values and your work? So it's both your values, your skills, and your talents. Do you feel like you are a good fit in this role? Do you feel part of something that matters? Do you have high-quality relationships with colleagues and clients? Do you feel that your work is valuable? So all of these things within your work environment are going to boost your sense of meaningfulness or take it away. And so the experience of meaningful work it's a positive psychological experience. And we can put these experiences into two big buckets. One is that my work matters, and one is that I matter. So the idea of my work mattering is, do I feel like what I'm doing is making a positive difference in the world? How does my piece fit into the bigger picture? So especially for that, if you think about especially more junior lawyers where they might have these drive-by assignments, they have no idea what it's about, how it fits, how it was used, what it was for. And so it just feels like this is futile and meaningless, and I don't even know what it's about. So the importance of connecting back to the bigger picture stokes that sense of meaningfulness. Am I part of something larger than myself? So that's in my work matters. What I'm doing is valuable and valued. And then the other bucket is that I matter, which is influenced by your work mattering, because you feel like you're valued if you feel like you're doing something that's valuable. But it's questions like, am I taken for granted? Am I able to use my skills and talents? Are those recognized? That we want your skill and talent, that's what's valued. We want your full person coming to work. And do I feel valued and valuable? So these are two big buckets in thinking about our interactions with each other and our leaders, what values they're communicating and what they're communicating, how they're communicating. Are they supporting these or are they undermining them? And the research on the positive impact of meaningful work is really great and promising. So my book, Positive Professionals, it's all around the work engagement research. And what it shows is the heart of engagement is meaningfulness. It's the biggest motivator of engagement. The biggest driver of engagement is the sense of meaningfulness, that my work matters and I matter. Job performance and satisfaction, lower stress, less turnover. There's many more. These are just a few things that the experience of meaningful work is connected to. And this is for everybody, men and women. It has these effects. But are there gender differences, which is a very relevant question for our topic tonight, that might make a difference in meaningful work and grit? So to get at this, I first want to ask a few questions to see what you all know or think already about what the research suggests in this area. All right, so first question. Men and women are equally likely to quit their jobs if they feel that their work is not meaningful. How many think that's true? How many think that's false? Yes, so this is a fairly consistent line of research showing that meaningful work is important to everybody, but women are more likely to leave than men if they don't have it. This gender reports more anger for actions that make them feel discounted, ignored, rejected, disrespected, or unjustly treated. How many think that's male? How many think that's female? So it's female, and I'd love to go deeply into the research on this because it's super interesting. But it's connected to both brain anatomy and brain chemistry, that the way women's brains are more bilateral than men's, and they're very relational, which isn't just relationships with people, it's relational with information. And so fairness becomes a very big part, or, patterns of women's behavior and reactions is a scanning and reaction to fairness. And so when women feel like they're being treated unfairly or others are treated unfairly, they react more. And they also there's a certain part of women's brains that are bigger that make them more attentive to all emotional stimuli, but negative stimuli in particular. And so they're picking up more data in the environment to begin with, and then they're reacting and noticing more strongly the negative stuff. So they're really experiencing a very different work environment than men are. Mutual affection and loyalty with one supervisor were positively related to retention of women, but not for men. How many think that's true? How many think false? So it's true, and this, again, is very consistent line of research showing that women are more relational. For both socialization and brain anatomy explanations, those relationships, and especially relationships with their direct supervisors, have a very big impact on their work experience and whether they stay or leave. Men are more likely than women to rate feeling valued as a person as a top concern at work. How many think that's true? How many think that's false? So we're getting it. This idea of valued in relationships, on average, is more important to women. A perceived lack of supervisory support is more likely to contribute to a woman's decision to quit than a man's. True? False? So true. Again, this idea of relationships, and especially the work that's focused on direct supervisor, especially the direct supervisor, has a bigger impact on women. Which gender places more importance on intrinsic values like affiliation and helping others relative to extrinsic ones, financial success, image, prestigious job? How many think that's male? How many female? Yep, so we're getting it. And this is true there's a number of studies showing this outside of law, but there's also a 2015 study on lawyer well-being that had the same finding, that women had a stronger orientation toward intrinsic values than men. And men are just more extrinsically oriented. Both genders have both, but it's just women have more of an orientation toward the intrinsic. Okay, a study of lawyers in 2004 found that lack of intrinsic rewards more strongly influenced which genders lawyers' departure from their law jobs. How many think that's female? How many male? Yep, we're getting it. It's the last one. So the 2004 study of lawyers found a striking gender difference in motives for going to law school. Blank, more likely to say they were motivated by money. Blank, more likely to cite altruistic desires to restructure society and serve the underprivileged. I bet we can all get that by now. That if starting from law school, that we're coming into law school with these different value systems, again, on average. One more. Men are more likely to rate meaningful work as the most important attribute of a job. I think we're all going to get that by now. That's false. That, again, men also want meaningful work. But when you're talking about what's the most important and are they going to leave or stay, it's more important to women. So from these studies and others that I've done work on, there's some themes that come out of this, and this isn't all of them, there's others, but this is what I have time to talk about. This idea of meaningful work, greater intrinsic than extrinsic values, feeling valued, respected, and fairly treated, supportive relationships, especially with the direct supervisors. There does appear to be gender patterns, gender differences in these general themes. And why might this be true? Again, I could talk for an hour on this because it's super interesting, but I'm just going to say sort of generally that it's a combination of biology and socialization, that women are more socialized to be oriented toward relationships. Men are more socialized to be oriented toward being a provider for their family. Brain chemistry, just one example, is testosterone is much more concentrated in men. Oxytocin is much more concentrated in women. Testosterone is linked to dominance, competition, aggression. Oxytocin is oriented toward wanting to connect and have relationships, and also just raises sensitivity to any emotional stimuli in the environment. So that single brain chemical has a difference in the way we react to our environment. And in brain anatomy, I talked about a couple of those things, that there have been some anatomy differences that have been found, patterns on average, that show, again, this relational orientation toward women, the bilateral tendencies for women's brain where we can think logically and creative at the same time. That's harder for men. They're one track and tend to see their one track is oriented toward how it affects them, and women are both track and oriented toward how does it affect everybody. And in decision making, women also tend to see more variables. And so if you're sitting in a meeting and the men are getting frustrated, they just want to get a decision made, and the women are saying, well, wait a minute, we need to think about this other thing. The men might then interpret that as women aren't decisive, where it's actually that women are just seeing more variables that need to be taken into consideration. And so the gender intelligence movement is saying, we need to talk about this. Men and women need to understand that there might be differences. So instead of criticizing women for not being decisive, there's an understanding that their brains might be functioning differently, and that might complement your style and result in a better decision. How am I doing on time? I'm going to just skip this. Yeah, but I didn't get my. I'm going to skip up that. So ask me about this slide during the networking event because it's really interesting. Okay, so why am I focusing on leadership for the idea of developing grit? And it's the reason I approach this as a leadership idea is because direct leaders, direct supervisors in particular, have an enormous impact on employees' experience of work. It's some research shows that it's 70% of an employee's experience of work is due to their direct supervisor's behaviors. And so the things that they can do to influence this sense of meaningful work or how you're experiencing work are framing. How are you communicating? Are you remembering to talk about mission, goals, purpose, and identity? When you give an assignment, are you talking about the importance of this to the client or the social values that we're trying to serve? Or is there only about don't build too much on this or make sure you meet your billable hours? Leaders also articulate compelling goals and values beyond money, enhance a sense of belonging, show confidence in the ability to achieve. Don't treat people as just a transaction for pay. We're not just cogs in the wheels. And these are all things that leaders, good leaders, effective leaders can do to enhance the experience of meaningful work. So how are our firms doing? If you reflect on these things about the values that are communicated in your organizations, where do we fall? Do they reflect some of these gender intelligence ideas that I'm talking about, or is what's primarily being communicated is about money, competition, social status, billing hours, revenue generation, and all those are good and important things. So the idea isn't to get rid of the conversation about profitability, it's to expand the discussion of values so that it also includes this idea of social impact. How are we helping each other? How are we helping our clients? How are we helping our communities? Are we caring about high-quality relationships and really paying attention to developing those? Are we making sure our people feel valued and that they have a sense of fit within our organizations? And some questions that you can ask about what really is valued. This is how the lawyers are going to be asking. They're going to look around and say, well, what's being rewarded? What's talked about the most? For what people are held accountable? What's discussion measured in performance reviews? Where is the investment? And for most large law firms, at least, it's going to be well, that's billable hours and revenue generation. And if that's taking up everybody's attention, there's not going to be enough in their attentional bandwidth to get into these other values. And so we need to start shifting how our leaders message, what they're saying, how they're holding people accountable, because that's the only way that culture will ever shift to expand to this broader set of values. So I want to leave you with a quote by one of my heroes, philosopher and psychologist William James. So it's act as if what you do makes a difference, because it does. And so that's the idea of what we do every day in our workplaces, what we do with our colleagues, what we do as leaders makes an enormous impact on whether each of us has a sense of belonging and meaningfulness. And so the idea that the grit isn't an individual sport, it's a team sport. That's really the overarching theme of what I'm trying to communicate, that what you do every day does matter. But what I also want to leave you with is this quote by Maya Angelou, which is, I love to see a young girl go out and grab the world by the lapels. Life's a bitch. You've got to go out and kick ass. And isn't this what we all want? This isn't just young girls. Don't we all want to go out and grab the world by the lapels and be badass ass kickers? We do, but again, this isn't it's not an individual support. What we need is to support each other, have support of our leaders, have support from our organizations, so all of us can live up to our best selves. Thank you. And I have to thank quickly Morgan Lewis, our fantastic host, that Anita Pollitt, who was the partner sponsor, Darcy Suarez, Tracy Betancourt, and Mona Zyberg, I can't even tell you, like, they so exceeded my expectations in their enthusiasm and support for this event. So I would just be remiss not to mention that. So thank you very much.